So yes, so Nick has asked me to talk to you a little bit about the plant monitoring scheme. Basically, the scheme in its wider sense, and then also now what we're hoping a number of you will take part in the Chilterns. So our plan for today, I'll give a bit of a background to the scheme. We'll talk a bit about how to get started. As Nick mentioned, there's various sort of extra materials, PDFs and guides and whatnot. So I'll talk to you a little bit about what you can expect to receive. Hopefully it won't be too overwhelming then if you know you get them in your mailbox or in your email box. We'll go through what everything you're expecting to receive and how to use it all. We'll talk about the survey methodology, so how to collect your plots and things and how to record the data. A little bit, I think, is just always useful to have a bit of a checklist, just about what you need to take with you in the field, things you need to be considering, and then of course where you can find support while you're taking part in your surveys. So just a little bit about the scheme as a whole. So I should just say as well, if you have any problem at all hearing me or there's any sort of disruption, we found that if you turn off your own video, sometimes that increases a bit of bandwidth. So if you're having any difficulty, of course, share in chat if you're having difficulty hearing us, but that is one thing to try. And similarly, I can do the same if you're having difficulty hearing me. Right, so about the National Plant Monitoring Scheme. So it's relatively young, I suppose, as far as long-term monitoring projects go. It's in its fifth, we've just collected its 5th year's worth of data, so we're in our 6th year now. And it was a scheme co-developed between sort of expert partners, being Plantlife, who I work for, the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, and we've recently got new partners. They weren't involved in the development, but now they've come on board, the Northern Irish Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs Office. So we've got a number of partners all working together and also alongside volunteers on the ground. So it was very, very important, obviously, when we were developing the scheme, that it was going to be a monitoring scheme that was inclusive, really, something that was going to be doable, you know, for want of a word, that people will be able to engage with and be able to happily crack on with and in a standardized way. So it was really important for that trial phase with both the contributors and the volunteers early on. And volunteers really from a variety of backgrounds. We didn't want this to be something just for expert botanists, for example. We really wanted something that could engage people from a variety of backgrounds and experiences. So as a background as to why the scheme was started, the NPMS was developed to provide an indication of changes in plant diversity, as the slide says, and abundance across UK habitats and through time. And that was really because it was recognised that there were long-standing schemes for monitoring populations of other taxa, such as birds. Also there was the UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme, but actually there wasn't something of this sort of large systematic scale for plants. So it was really crucial to have a better understanding of plant populations, and there was this need for this large coverage over the UK and a systematic approach, because basically there's otherwise potential to mask trends and weaken signals. So a brief history there you can see of the scheme. The 4 partners came together in 2012, and that's really where development started and trials started. And we really started to talk to our different partners, different experts in the field and potential volunteers. And a pilot was run in 2014. The scheme itself was then launched properly in 2015. And that's why, as I say, 2019 was our 5th year of data collection, which was really important for and exciting for us, actually, because that means this spring we've been celebrating 5 years of data, and that's when we can really actually start showing trends and start telling stories coming from our data. It's a very tricky thing when you first start a large-scale long-term monitoring scheme, because the first few years it's very hard to feed back what we're actually seeing, because it is a long-term monitoring scheme. So we do need to wait a few years before we're able to get some of those stories back, but we're in that position now. And also really exciting year now, because of course the Chilterns Tracking the Impact project is adopting the NPMS methodology on specific squares within within the area. So as Nick said, around 50 squares within the Chilterns are now going to be used or surveyed using NPMS methodology. So as I say, there was a real need for a robust national survey with a standardised approach. So everybody using the same methodology so that the data can be analysed to the highest quality. And there was really the need to include semi-natural habitat, so beyond those protected areas, beyond say national parks or sites of scientific interest or these various protected areas. We needed to know what was going on outside these areas. And what was happening in relation to different drivers of change. So I'm thinking about climate change or habitat management, response to invasive species and air pollution, and various different drivers of change. So it's a really whistle-stop sort of bullet point breakdown of why the scheme was established. It was to establish indicator trends of biodiversity and abundance, to monitor the impact of different management types, to support and enable improved reporting against stakeholder objectives and work plans. So we're thinking of areas that are managed, thinking about national nature reserves, for example, AONBs, national parks, and really to be able to support their work plans and their monitoring aims. And just really to add value and augment other data sets. And all the data provided through NPMS is freely available on the National Biodiversity Network. So I'm not going to go too much more into the background of the general, the nationwide NPMS, because obviously we're thinking about the Chilterns today, but this just gives a nice friendly overview of the scheme as a whole. So across the country we have, I mean, that number's a little bit out of date now. We've more like 1,500 volunteers currently across the UK allocated survey squares, and they have between 1 and 5 between them. So some folk take on a number of squares where they feel they're able to do so. We have around, again, a little bit out of date, nearly 900 kilometre squares with data since 2015. And around half of all of our survey squares nationwide, just over half, around 60%, are currently allocated by volunteers. And you'll see a little bit later, you can see on this diagram here, it shows that we ask people to monitor around 408 indicator species within 11 broad-scale habitats. And I'll come on to those species and those habitats a little bit later. So that's just an average map there across the UK. But of course, we're zoning a little bit closer to home for you chaps now. And as I said, it was lovely to speak to Nick and to talk about how NPMS is now going to be used, and that methodology is going to be used within the Chilterns Tracking the Impact project. So as Nick has said, there are 50 survey squares across the Chilterns AONB at the moment. I'm not sure which of those are allocated currently, Nick, but these are all the squares, I believe, that were randomly designated, I believe, across the Chilterns.
Yeah,
Correct me if I'm wrong, right, Nick?
Yeah, so the Bucks and Milton Keynes Environmental Record Centre, they went through a kind of randomisation process for us to come up with those squares. So there are some rules we wanted to avoid, obviously the urban areas, and doing a plant survey in the middle of Wickham is probably not going to be much fun. So there are a few rules that we adapted, but essentially it's randomly generated across to give us a representation across the various habitat types that we have in the central Chilterns. So yeah,
lovely. It's a really nice even spread actually across the area as well. And essentially there is coming, it's developed, it's very nearly ready for release. There's a bespoke volunteer group data portal. So once this data is collected, there will be a plant portal website, for want of a better word, where the volunteers involved in this scheme in the Chilterns will be able to submit their data for analysis. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on further. So yes, we want to be able to provide, and this goes for the Chilterns as well, a reliable measure of change for individual species and species group within those semi-natural habitats that Nick's just mentioned. And something that's really key to mention, we're utilising both positive and negative indicators, indicator species for each habitat. So species that can help us to investigate habitat health and the health of the habitat. So negative indicators, as the name would suggest, suggesting poor habitat health, or positive indicator species that give us a bit more of a positive impression of the habitat health. So it's really important that the methodology that we're going to run through today is simple, it's repeatable, and it's achievable. So I appreciate that when you first get the guidance materials and the methodology, there seems to be quite a lot to take in. But it really is, once you do your first survey, or even once your plot is set up, it's a very simple, repeatable survey to carry out on your plots. So the basics of it, each person is randomly allocated a 1 kilometre square, or indeed more than one if they feel they want to take more than 1 kilometre square on. Within each square, they establish just 5 plots. So we're not asking everybody to survey the whole of their 1 kilometre square. That would be quite an undertaking. So there's just 5 plots that we ask folk to establish in their square. And these should really represent different habitat types, and NPMS habitat types, which I'll cover in a moment. So each plot should be within a specific habitat and avoid sort of any mosaic or patchiness, basically, within that plot. But they're only very small plots, so that's very achievable. We ask everybody to record abundance of these indicator species that I've mentioned and other background information. We'll go through the recording sheet. And just to carry out this survey twice a year, once in the late spring and again in late summer. And as Nick said, we have missed the first survey for this year, but that's absolutely fine. A little bit of a bugbear of mine is that we quite often call them survey 1 and survey 2, which gives a suggestion that you have to have done the 1 before you do number 2, but that's not the case at all. They should just be called the spring survey and the summer survey, and it's absolutely fine to start on the summer survey, because of course we have people signing up to the scheme all throughout the year, and it's better to get started whenever you can, really. So if you have this time now between me speaking to you today and the late summer, whether you plan to get out in August, you've got a good amount of time really to get to know the materials, as Nick said, and plan your surveys ahead of that late summer survey. So I'm not going to go through what's on this page here, but I've included it in the presentation just for when we send it to you. If you'd like any more information about the scheme, what it's doing nationally, what we're starting to see within the data, I've included a couple of links there of documents and blogs and things that we've released this year, really celebrating the last 5 years of the scheme and what the data is starting to tell us about understanding the health of our habitat. So please feel free. They're quite nice, like friendly reading about what we're starting to see. So I don't know if there's any questions that have just come from what I've said already. I've seen the chat bar pinging up, but I've not said anything.
Yeah, there's nothing on the chat, Rachel. I suppose just to reiterate your introduction there, for everything you've described on a national level about the value of being able to see what's happening to trends on a national perspective. The national surveys, whether it's plant monitoring scheme or whether it's the wider countryside butterfly survey, are brilliant nationally with your representative samples, but they don't tell us in the Chilterns, they don't give us that richness to be able to do the similar conclusions as they do in the Chilterns. So really the essence of tracking the impact is trying to mirror essentially what you just described, Rachel, but in the Chilterns context, so we can draw up our own kind of trend in time when we've got enough data to look at what's happening in our patch, as well as contributing data to the broader national kind of data set, if you like. So the data you'll be collecting will be informing our work locally in the Chilterns, but it'll also be used by Plantlife and the scheme to help bolster kind of national data sets as well. So a real kind of double whammy, I guess, really in a way from our perspective.
Yeah, it really is, and you'll be using an established and trialed and tested methodology, and almost in that sort of more concentrated way by having 50 squares within the Chilterns, as you say, Nick, you'll be able to provide you with more information for your specific area. So thinking about getting started. So if you're interested, if you haven't already been allocated a square, if you're interested in taking part, of course you need to register your interest with Nick, presumably. If you'd be interested in taking on one of these squares, in which case you'll then be allocated a 1 kilometre square. Presumably that's going to be thinking about what's local to you, what's accessible, and that's something to arrange with Nick. And then you will receive your survey materials, hopefully not too long after I've given this presentation. And that's all survey materials that I can provide to Nick, and I believe they're being sent to you digitally. Again, Nick, correct me if I'm wrong, but I will go through what this survey pack altogether will include.
Yeah,
So
I'll send all these out afterwards, Rachel. Yeah,
perfect. Yeah, it's nice to have a bit of forewarning of what you're going to be what you're going to be getting. What you'll be receiving is survey guidance notes. So that's really where you're going to find the survey methodology, again, talking through how to actually carry out the surveys, but also how to select your plots and thinking about your habitat type. So that really is your go-to how to complete the surveys. Within the survey pack, you'll also receive your species list. You can see there on the photograph. The species list is exactly what it says on the tin. So for each of the habitat types and the fine scale habitat types, you are provided with a list of species that you are asked to record. So for example, if you have a plot within lowland grassland plot, say it's neutral pastures and meadows, for that particular fine scale habitat we are interested in, and then there'll be a list of particular indicator species that we ask folk to record. The number of species that you're asked to record depends on the level that you survey at. So again, I think that's the next, or maybe the second next slide that we talk about. There are options to survey at different levels depending on your experience and your comfort and your ability. But really, that's the main thing to say about the species list, is within that lovely booklet, there's just a list of the particular species that we are interested in you recording within each habitat. There's also a lovely species ID guide. It's a field ID book just containing all of those indicator species. Excuse me. There's also recording forms. I'm gonna have to have a drink. So a recording form for you to print out and take with you on site, which we'll be working through as well. And the last thing that you'll receive is a map of your square. Now, this doesn't look like a Google map, or it looks a bit more like an OS map, but it's a map of your square with a grid reference and some recommended plots, also some indication of the habitat types you're likely to find on your square, and you'll be using that really to help you to decide where to create your plots in your square. And again, we'll have a little look at one of those maps shortly and think about how to use it. So all the pack materials are also available on the NPMS website. So while Nikki's going to be emailing these things to you, we have a number of different resources on the NPMS website, which you are of course more than welcome to access, whether it's from species identification guides or spare copies of recording forms or whatnot. It's all on, yes, the NPMS site, which I can provide you a link to as we go through. Once you've received all your survey pack contents and you've read them through and you're happy and you're confident that you know what your next steps are, we ask you to contact landowners to get permissions to access the sites. Of course, we want people to be accessing their sites with permission, and that's of course particularly important at the moment during the current COVID-19 situation. We want landowners to be comfortable with people going on their on their land. There'll be a number of public access land, of course, but again, I think with current situation, I think it is still courtesy to be letting those authorities or whoever's the landowner know that you're going to be accessing the site to conduct surveys.
Rachel, sorry to keep jumping in on accessible land. Obviously, I would love to help you and make contact with all the landowners across all the 3 species groups, but I probably haven't got the capacity to do that. But so essentially we're rather limited to public accessible land or where you can negotiate with landowners. But we have 18 farmers in a cluster group that we're working with as another part of the project, and their land covers around about 6,500 hectares of the project area, and they've all said they're happy for yourselves or butterfly or bird surveyors to access their land if your square happens to kind of overlap and your plot overlaps on their land. So I've pulled together a map, and I'll send it out again of where the squares overlay with the farms. So if your square overlays with the farm, then let me know and I'll give you the contact details for the farmer, and then they should be able to make contact with them and arrange to go and see them and work out where you want to go. So that won't cover all the squares, but it will make a kind of a dent in some of them.
That is a fab start. Thank you. So I guess the first thing to do is obviously speak to Nick and find out if there is this overlap. But a little bit later on as well. So this is a common issue as well we have with NPMS nationally, but obviously we've got 2,000 and odd squares, so we definitely don't have the resources to be able to keep on top of these things. So we do provide our volunteers with a number of tips and guidance and advice on how to find out who the landowners are. And again, once we've gone through the actual survey, I've got a slide providing tips on finding out and requesting access. So once you've contacted your landowners, we strongly recommend, and I think it's essential, that you carry out a reconnaissance visit to really identify your NPMS habitats and to establish your plots and make sure that you're happy with where you're going to be carrying out your surveys. Once you have decided on where your plots are, make sure that they're recorded, the plot locations recorded very carefully so that you can, of course, relocate them. And then the last thing really to do before you conduct your surveys is to agree your survey dates with the landowners as required. Some may say, yeah, just go in and out, that's fine. But again, it's a very good idea just to let them know these are the dates that I'm planning to be on your land, which I think is fair enough. So the next thing really to say, and I've already mentioned it, is you need to choose your survey level. So as I mentioned, there are 3 levels at which volunteers can survey at, depending on, as I say, your experience, your comfort, your ID ability. The first is the wildflower level. So that's, I think lowest is probably not the right word, but that's for those people starting out in botany or perhaps are not as confident with ID. That's the wildflower level. Within that, there's 212 easily identifiable species. And again, you're not going to find all 212 of those on one plot or in one habitat. Those are divided between the different habitat types. So for example, within each habitat type, and I think the example I've got here down on the right, broadleaf woodland, there'll be around 10 to 15 species per fine scale habitat within that wildflower level. The next level up is the indicator level. So that's kind of an intermediate level, and that's an expanded list of around 408 species altogether. And again, they're divided into groups applicable for the habitats. So they include species that are a little bit more challenging to identify, so more grasses, more ferns and sedges. And there's around 30 species per habitat that we ask surveyors to record. But having said that, even though they're a little bit trickier, again, these indicator species were really, I bet you can imagine, they spent a lot of time considering what these species would be, and they were really decided on a combination of ease of identification, how likely they are to be confused with other species, and also were they strong, good indicator species of habitat health, whether that's negative or positive indicators. And lastly, we have the inventory level, and that really is designed for volunteers who are capable of recording all vascular plant species that they find in a habitat. So for that, we don't set people a list, they just record absolutely everything that they can see on their plot. Something to note about the survey level, it's not fixed. So if you enter the scheme at a wildflower level, for example, and you get a little bit more experience, you get more confident, the next year you can well go up to an indicator level. In fact, that's really encouraged. It's lovely to see, volunteers develop in their confidence and their ability, and it's a lovely thing for yourselves as well. So yes, it's by no means fixed, and quite often we see, I think we can all be quite British and a bit modest about things. Quite often people will start at a lower level than they're actually capable and go, oh, do you know what, I'm seeing a lot more than I thought, and I'm a little bit more capable. And quite often we see people move up to the indicator level. So yes, take a look through the methodology and the species lists and decide what level you're comfortable at. But do remember that not everything will be in flower, particularly in that sort of early spring, so that can make it a little bit harder to identify. So although you may be super duper confident with certain species in flower, they may not always be in flower when you're conducting the spring survey. So that's something to think about. So getting to know your survey square and your plots. As I've mentioned, you will be receiving a habitat map or a square map of your square. And this, just on this slide here, is an example of what this may look like. So you get sort of an OS map. Upon that map, you can see different colours of shading that denotes, and there will be a key with the map, the habitat type that is considered to be in those different areas. Now, this is not set in stone. These maps, much like many of these maps, they're composite maps. They're built from lots of information from different places, and they were developed a short while ago. So there may have been changes in that time. They may be a little bit inaccurate, but it's a starting point. And very much we recommend that you go on site and just double check and be sure what those habitat types are. So as I say, you get this habitat map in your survey pack. Do also use Ordnance Survey maps, and I believe there's a great Ordnance Survey website, grid reference website, that you can take a little look around. View your square on Google Maps. That's super helpful. I personally find that particularly helpful when I'm thinking about things like access, not just in terms of landowners, but also how I'm actually going to get to site, how far I may need to walk, where I may be able to park if I need to drive to site, for example. I've already said certainly review the habitats on the ground, and 100% recce. Go and visit the plots and make sure that you're happy with the habitat type and that you can access, and that you'll be able to relocate your plots. And that's why I've added a little note there to consider landmarks. Relocating plots actually is quite tricky sometimes. No matter, even if you take down your GPS or you take photos, it can be really tricky, but it's important to make sure that you're recording in the same plot each time. So do consider landmarks, things that you can use, you can look at, you can think about, it's however many meters from that signpost or that big oak, or consider these different landmarks to help you relocate your plots. And as I've said, consider land access and safety. So not just, we talked a lot about landowners and land access, but also safety. Is it somewhere particularly remote? Have you got phone signal? What's the ground cover like? So think about where you're comfortable to survey as well. We've got a number of helpful frequently asked questions and tips on the NPMS website and the resources page, which you are, again, more than welcome. It's all publicly accessible, so please do take a look at those, and that there's a lot of tips on how to pick your plots and how to carry out your recce's.
Rachel, sorry, quick question that's coming on the chat.
Yeah.
Going back to the different in levels of the survey.
Yeah.
Liz is asking, are we including lichens in this?
No.
No. Okay. That's probably a relief to most
That's
people.
That's the short answer.
That's quite a good relief to a lot of people, I guess. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Yes. No. Yeah. No lichens are included. I think that would add a whole other level to the survey. So no. Right. So when it comes to selecting your plots, so I've done another shot of this nice example habitat map here, where you can see the key at the bottom. Now this is the kind of key that you'll receive on your habitat map. This is a particularly nice example because there's quite a nice variety of habitat types to choose from. It can be quite a mixed bag. Hopefully a number of you will have a nice variety of habitats to pick from. On this square, or within your survey square, we ask that you record on 3 5x5 meter plots. So as I said, they're not particularly large plots. They're 10 by 10 meter if they are in woodland sites. So 3 square plots and 2 linear plots, which again, I think it's the next slide. I'll talk a little bit about the difference and how to set these up. The important thing for me to just stress though is that's the recommendation. That's what we ask. But of course, all kilometre squares vary, and that may not be possible. You may have more linear features that would allow you to have, a greater variety of habitat types. So that's not fixed in stone. That's the point that I'm making. It may be that you have 3 linear plots and 2 square plots. That's just the recommendation. And the other thing to note is as well, ideally, please do try to record on 5 plots. But again, if it's absolutely not possible to get all 5 plots, if you need to do 3 or 4, that's fine. Do not write off the square. Do not say it's not going to be possible to do 5 on this square. That's still absolutely fine. Reasons that perhaps you can't get all 5 plots, maybe land access issues, the landowner, or safety. This isn't going to affect you chaps in the Chilterns, but some of our sites, for example, they're near coast, so there's literally not that much land. So yes, there's a variety of reasons why you may not be able to get all 5, but do try if at all possible. It says where possible use a pre-selected plot location. That won't be applicable yet because this is the very start of the project, but this is something that we say to folk if for any reason a square needs to be released, say the person moves away or they can no longer survey for any personal reason, and somebody takes up a square, or if you take on a square of somebody else, please use a pre-selected plot that's already been created and has been surveyed. Don't create new squares, new plots, sorry, but that shouldn't be an issue yet. And only really carry out surveys in the NPMS habitats as listed in the guidance materials and the species list. So I've already mentioned we ask you ideally locate each plot in a different habitat. Again, it depends on your square. This may not always be possible, but ideally where you can have a different habitat type. And that's nice for, I think, for you as well. It mixes up the different plots and means you get to see greater variety. As you can see on this map, there's lots of these little numbered squares all throughout. These are recommended locations for square plots, and these have really been created, and these look different on everybody's square. These have been created to avoid selection bias. So I'm sure, as you can well imagine, quite often human nature, we tend to veer towards the areas that are super interesting or really pretty or nice for us to visit, or yeah, as I say, I guess that's human nature, and that's what we quite often tend to do. And we try and avoid that selection bias. So if at all possible, go for these randomly generated locations for plots. Go and visit those that you think may be possible if they fall within a habitat. If you can survey on any of those plots, please do. That's not always possible, in which case you have to self-select your own plot, and you just set up a plot somewhere that is possible and within the a specific habitat type and is accessible, but do aim to look at those first.
So Rachel, can I just clarify on that point? So rather than wandering aimlessly, but not quite around the square trying to find somewhere, essentially as a kind of a shortcut, if you aim for the number 5 on your slide or the number 6 on your slide, and that works practically, that's a pretty good place to start, assuming it works on the ground. Okay,
exactly.
That's a really helpful shortcut.
But do bear in mind, obviously, they are created by it's computer software. It's not a person there on the ground going, oh, this is a perfect plot. So some of them, simply won't be possible, but certainly that's a starting point. These recommended square little plots that we've provided.
I'll send round. I'll put a note in the chat as well, but I'll send round these maps. I've got them all downloaded, and I'll send them round to you, so you've got those as a kind of a starter as well after today.
Yeah, brilliant. And as another tip we have for linear plots, we tend to say it's really useful to have a linear plot where a feature, so we tend to have linear plots on features like rivers or roads, hedgerows, for example. It's really handy to have those where the feature intersects a grid line or boundary line, and that's really to help relocating them and to plot them. That's a really helpful, it's just a tip really. It makes it easier to relocate them.
Sorry, Rachel, again, a question coming on the chat. Claudia's asked around the 5 plots, is that a minimum, or is that, so could they do 6 or 7, or is it actually 5, and is that the maximum number of plots per square?
We don't necessarily limit people, so if they do have if they want to do 6 or 7, that is fine. We certainly wouldn't stop anybody doing that. We tend to say 5 is the ideal, though, to cover that area, and that tends to be what's really achievable, actually, and it's not going to take up a huge amount of time. So I'd recommend that set up 5 and see how long that's taking you and how comfortable you feel with that. If you are desperate, you've got another site that would be really great, and you think, yeah, I can totally fit that in as well, then do so. But as I think our average across the country, actually, I think our average is around 4 plots, even though we ask people to do 5.
And another question, sorry, a linear feature,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you're going to probably come on to define it. I'm assuming that's a field margin or a ditch or a hedge, or what
Yeah, so
constitutes a
we'll go
linear
along
feature?
a feature, yes. So we're thinking, as I said, arable field margins,
Yeah.
hedgerows, rivers, roadsides,
Okay.
yeah, linear features. So as you can see, well, on the next slide here, when you're laying out your survey plot, as I've mentioned, the square plot we ask is 5 by 5 meters for all habitats other than woodland, in which case we do ask a 10 by 10 meter grid plot square. And the linear plot is 1 by 25 meters generally, and there's a lovely straight line there, lovely straight linear plot. But as we know, if we're following a linear feature, unless it is an arable field margin or possibly a hedgerow, then always going to be linear, and that's absolutely fine. They can, you know, if you're thinking about riverbanks or along a pond, for example, that is fine for it to curve with the feature. We do ask that linear plots are 1 by 25 meters, but if that's not always possible, so a linear habitat may be shorter than that 25 meter plot, just you need to record the complete length of your linear feature on your recording form, just so that you know, when the data is submitted and we talk about abundance, we know that the size of the plot that was surveyed. But generally we're looking for 1 by 25 meters. There are specific instructions for linear plots, and these are really these do vary between the different habitat types that you survey, and this can all be read when you get them from Nick, of course, on page 16 to 18 of the survey guidance notes. So I'm just going to have a little look at the survey guidance notes to make sure that I don't forget to say anything now. But basically, you can see the little diagrams there, that these are taken straight from the survey guidance notes actually. So an example of the specific guidance may be if you are carrying out a linear survey along an arable margin. For example, we ask that the plot extends 1 meter from the edge of the cultivated area into the crop. So be very mindful, if ever you're setting up these linear plots, to just double check those guidance notes that you're doing it sort of in the area that we're particularly interested. You may automatically assume that we're interested in data collected in the permanent strip, so with pollinator crop, for example, as you can see in that, but we're not. We want 1 meter into the cultivated area. And similarly with waterside, whether you streams or ponds, any sort of linear plots alongside standing waters, we ask that the plot should extend 1 meter from the normal water level in. So funnily enough, we're looking more for freshwater species. So we're not looking on the bank, for example. Similarly, I'm thinking now hedgerows, we ask 1 meter out of the centre of the hedgerow, or the outer 1 meter section of the hedgerow if it's a particularly wide hedgerow, of course. So where you have got linear features, do double check which or where. It's generally 1 meter out from the centre or 1 meter from the start of that feature that we ask you to record. They're the main three. I'm trying to think of any off the top of my head, but just do double check with the survey guidance notes. Oh, road verges is another one actually. They're not really a habitat targeted by the NPMS in their own right, but they do frequently contain NPMS habitats. So I'm thinking about heath and grassland, for example, and where road verges are found to correspond with target habitats, they should be recorded using the relevant species list. So that's something to note for road verges as well.
Couple of questions on the chat, Rachel, specifically on that. I think you've covered it, but maybe just to reiterate. Claudia's asked if your linear plot includes a watercourse, do the surveyors include aquatic plants? I think you kind of covered that, but it'd be good just to reiterate.
Freshwater plants, yeah, we do, especially because we're taking it from a meter in. So yeah, we do have a list. So freshwater is one of our habitat species. Let me have a little look. I'm trying to think what the fine scale habitats are for freshwater. Let me have a little look. So freshwater is one of our broad scale habitats, and within that we have nutrient poor lakes and ponds, nutrient rich lakes and ponds, and rivers and streams. So yes, there are freshwater plants within those habitat species lists.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I'm thinking of other examples now as I'm going. There's, of course, there's springs and flushes. Yes. So there's a number of different options for linear plots there.
And a question also from Rose. Rose, if I'm not quite sure if I've answered your question right, then please feel free to unmute yourself and ask. But Rose asked, would that be only be the complete length of the linear feature in a survey square? Rose, have I asked your question properly there? Or if you can hear me, if you want to unmute, maybe make sure I've done your question justice there. Are you there, Rose?
Oh, I am.
Oh, there she is. Hello.
I had to find the unmute button. What I meant is, if you don't have a linear feature of a whole 25 meters in your survey square, but it extends outside your survey square, would you sort of go outside your 1 kilometer square, or you just stop at the boundary?
Oh, that's a really good question. No, we only data. I mean, this is for NPMS, and if Nick, you're completely using NPMS methodology within the Chilterns, we do only accept data that's collected within your designated survey square. So it would need to stop, and you'd record the length of that feature that you have surveyed.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Rose. And sorry, Rachel, another question from Andrew on this specific linear linear point here. So Andrew's asking about the 1 meter. It's about the size of scale into cultivated fields. So if linear, then 1 meter into cultivated will mean entirely in. So would you survey you're entirely into the cultivated element? Andrew, I've probably not again done your question justice there, but if you want to unmute yourself and maybe ask Rachel your question specifically. Andrew, are you there? Are you able to unmute yourself, Andrew?
There he is, yes.
I know I was looking at the wrong place. My question is, if you're doing a linear plot and it's 1 meter by 25 meters, and you're saying plot should extend 1 meter into the cultivated area, wouldn't that take the whole linear plot in the cultivated area, and you'd be ignoring everything that's actually grown in the set aside bit of the field?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So you'd be running 25 meters alongside that cultivated area, and yes, you're not doing your survey within that sort of, as you say, that pollinator crop area to the side, and that's really, we're interested in seeing what else is still creeping up in those margins, really, and it is important to note actually that these arable field margin plots should only really be placed on the margins of annually cultivated fields that being cropped for, say, cereals, maize, oilseed rape, root vegetables, for example, whereas fields that are being used to produce perennial crops, so I'm thinking about biofuel crops or fruit, for example, should be ignored, basically.
So we're just looking at what's grown in amongst the actual commercial.
Yeah, within that meter from the cultivated area.
Okay. So if you're trying to avoid anything that's planted artificially, is the wrong phrase, isn't it? But it's actually been planted specifically. Yeah.
Yeah. You're looking for annual within that 1 meter. Yeah.
Good stuff. Thank you.
Okay. Brilliant. So actually that does lead me, because I realised I've talked a bit about the different habitats without introducing them. So this table here just shows the actual habitat types that we are particularly interested in, and we ask you to record in. So you've got the 11 broad categories there, just down the left-hand side. And that's the first thing to identify. So when you're on a plot, make sure you can identify the broad scale category, and then if at all possible, within those broad scale categories, we do ask that you identify your habitat down to the fine scale habitat within those broad scales. So some, like arable field margins, which we've just been talking about, only have the one fine scale habitat type, but others have a number of different fine scale habitats nested within them. So you may have a bog and wet heath habitat, and in fact on your plot it's a raised bog, for example, or a wet heath. Or we've talked about, I've already mentioned the freshwater. There's heathland habitats. If you can identify it to heathland, and then you can identify it down to dry heathland or dry montane heathland, for example. So really speaking, please do identify down to the fine scale habitat. That's really what's most useful for the analysis later. And I don't know how confident everybody is with identifying the habitat type. It seems like something that's quite easy before we set out, and then of course you actually stand on site, and trying to whittle it down sometimes to the fine scale habitat can be the first hurdle really when you're doing these surveys. But there's lots of different resources that can be provided and support. We can help in a number of ways with helping people to identify their habitat type, whether it's the species, not the species, the survey guidance notes, the methodology booklet that I was telling you about does have an appendix with images and descriptions and guidance on how to identify fine scale habitats. We also have a number of resources that's free to use on the NPMS website that I'll sort of link you to now in the later slides. But it really is, if at all possible, you can record at the broad scale, but if at all possible, please do identify your habitat type down to the fine scale habitats.
And I guess, Rachel, sorry, Joy, just to jump in there, that list looks quite, unless you're particularly into it, is quite daunting. But actually, when you strip it down in the Chilterns, we're probably only really going to be focusing on field margins, broadleaf, woodland, possibly some fresh water, and then I guess the key one's going to be lowland grassland as well.
Yeah.
And working through. So actually they will boil down. It looks like a big list, but actually in reality in our patch, a lot of those we just haven't got. So
yeah. And that's it. I mean, if you think there's, you know, we're going to, I would presume we're stripping out our native pinewood and juniper straight off the bat on our coast. So that not that many.
Either. Yeah.
Yeah. So and you can see from the side there, it shows the number of wildflower species that are recorded in each of those fine scale habitats and the number of indicator species. So if you let me I'm just going to introduce you to them just a little bit more. I'm not going to go too much into detail, especially for those that you're very unlikely to come across. But as I just said, from page 27 of the survey guidance notes there, put a picture of that you'll be receiving from Nick. That is where we have a full appendix of the broad scale and the fine scale habitats nested within those, with habitat descriptions and images. And they're really, really useful. They look something along the lines of this. So we have broadleaf woodland, which you may well find, and the 3 different fine scales there: dry deciduous, hedgerows of native species, and wet woodlands. Again, I've not spent much time there talking about native pinewood and juniper scrubs. I don't think you're going to be coming across many of those. Arable field margins. Again, there's no fine scale within that. There's your lowland grasslands. That comprises dry acid grassland, dry calcareous grassland, neutral damp grassland, and neutral pastures and meadow, which I can well imagine you may find all of the above in the area. But the other thing to mention, where we talk about creating your plots and trying to have different habitat types, we can also mean they're different fine scale habitat types. So you may think, oh God, my whole square is pretty much lowland grassland. Well, that's fine, because you may well have different fine scale habitat types within that square. So try and have as much variety of these fine scale habitats between your plots. Upland grassland, I don't think we're going to be seeing a great deal of that. We have heathland with dry heathland and dry montane heathland. Again, I don't think we're going to be getting too much bog and wet heath, but you can see the different fine scale habitats nested under there: blanket bog, raised bog, and wet heath. Marsh and fen, so we have acidic fens, flushes, mires, and springs. That has its own species list, as well as bitch raised fens, flushes, mires, and springs. There's freshwater habitats, so I've already mentioned these. The fine scale habitats that we ask you to record on within that broad scale habitat is nutrient poor lakes and ponds, nutrient rich lakes and ponds, rivers and streams. And again, just to reiterate, within our habitat descriptors and images within that appendix, it does very much help with how to identify those different fine scales. So thinking about soil type, thinking about indicator species, what you're likely to see there. Some nice photograph examples, but also we do have additional, as I say, resources on the NPMS website, which I will flag now. And you know, a lot of people send us, I don't mind at all receiving them, and you can have my email address. A lot of people will send us images for some help with ID. I'm sure Nick will be helpful, or if you set up a group amongst yourselves to you know, get other folks' opinions. Sometimes it just helps, doesn't it? Even if you're really sure, you know, talk to other people around and get their advice. Don't just send pictures, of course. Give some descriptions of the types of species you were seeing and the area that you were in.
Rachel, can I jump in on that one? Absolutely, feel free to send photos through to me. I can help. for those of you that are on the WhatsApp group as well, feel free to put them on there, and we can have a bit of a chat around and help you with the habitat types.
Yeah.
Question from Colin's coming as well. So I think it's talking really there around where we have a ride or a glade in an open glade in a woodland. Would you class that as kind of a grassland feature or a woodland feature?
Gosh, that would be very hard to answer without sort of seeing the glade,
Right.
and knowing the example. It would depend on a number of things, really. The size of the glade, I think, the area around it, the size of the woodland. So that's quite hard to know without seeing. So that's something. If you're in that situation, write down some notes and some pictures, and we can kind of decide between us, I think.
Yeah, let me know on that one, Colin, and we'll work it out. Yeah.
I imagine it may be a woodland, but that again, it may not be. It really is case dependent.
Thank you.
So again, I just skipped over the rock outcrops and of course coast, because I don't think any of you are going to find the coast, but you can see we have quite a number of fine scale habitats within coast. So this next slide really just sort of shows how to use that species list document or booklet that you'll be getting within your survey pack. So that just shows the front page, so you know which one I'm talking about, and you'll see that within each habitat, so you've got a heathland as an example here. That's the broad scale. So it says heathland comprising dry heathland, dry montane heathland. So it's got the full list of all the indicator species for that broad scale habitat, and that is if you're just unable, and even with our help we're not able to identify it down to a fine scale habitat, you can use that larger broad scale species list. But as an example, if you are able to whittle it down to fine scale habitat, the example on the far right there shows dry heathland, and as you can see it's a shorter list of the species that we are interested in your recording. So as I've noted there, so there's the wildflower list. So if you're recording at that wildflower level, sort of the more beginner level, all those species with that nice little flower symbol along the side, those are the species we're particularly interested in you recording. So for any of those species that you see, we ask you to record that they are there and the abundance. If you can see a species there and you can well identify it, but it's not on that list, it won't. It's not something that you're not recording it. So we only want you to record the species on that list. Some of those species on that list may well not be in your plot, and that's absolutely fine. That's just as important information as presence data. Absence data is equally important. So basically for all those species on the wildflower list, record when they are present on your plot. And then as you can see, the next column there says indicator, and that's for anybody recording at the indicator level. So basically all of those species. So if you see any of those species at all, there's around 30 there within your plot, please record them and the abundance. That plus or minus sign, not to be confused. Some folk can get a little bit confused because it's got a minus, so they think they don't need to record it, but that plus or minus denotes whether it's a positive or a negative indicator of habitat health. So it's all of those species on that indicator list that we would ask you to record. So you can see having this list makes it a lot easier. It makes it take a lot less time than having to go to a plot and record absolutely everything. You're just looking for those specific species. And that's quite helpful as well, because before you're going to your plot, you can kind of familiarise yourself. You can look at that list. You can think, right, this is what I'm looking for. You can maybe do a little bit of research, look at your field ID guides, and just get to know that sort of habitat type in terms of what species that we're asking you to record. Even before you go, unless of course you are somebody who is at the inventory level, in which case these lists are not that useful because you record absolutely everything.
Rachel,
so
quick question from Claudia on that point. I think she's asking if she finds a species on her plot from a different habitat type, is she not recording them? So if you find some, do you have a kind of a miscellaneous ad hoc records list, or literally only just ignore it and take the ones off your particular list? So
only the ones, we very much only want the ones on that list, because you're going to see other species. You will see other species on your plot that aren't on the list. You absolutely will. But these are just the particular indicator species that we use for the indicator analysis, so to indicate the habitat health. If you do record something and you're super interested in it, or you want your own personal record for it, or it might be something that's really rare and a bit odd actually, and you think it should be noted down, this is something I need to talk to Nick about. We do have the option for NPMS national volunteers that they have an extra species recording form on their data portal, and they can record it in that way. I don't see why that can't be an additional function of the plant portal for the Chilterns group as well, because as you say, they may well be something that you want your own personal record. You want to see, you want to show that you've seen that particular species. So there is an option to do that, but you very much don't put it on the survey form when you're uploading your data for your particular plot. It needs to be in an extra species sort of record, if that makes sense.
Yep. And sorry, a question from Rose. We're going back a little bit to the plots. Rose is asking what happens if there are not 5 different habitats in her square? Can she do 2 plots from the same habitat type?
Yeah, if they simply aren't, then that's fine. Yeah, of course. Not all squares will have 5 completely different habitat types. Having said that, do remember they might be, even though they're not broad scale habitats, they might be different fine scale habitat types, so that tends to increase the number. But certainly, you may have a particularly arable area, for example, or lots of woodland areas. That's absolutely fine. That's the ideal, is having 5 different habitat types. But if that's simply not possible, then that's absolutely fine to have 2 woodland plots, for example. The other thing, bit of a tip worth noting here on the species list is alongside each species, as well as showing which are wildflower indicators and which are on the indicator species list, you can see there's a page number with a number next to the species on that far right hand side. That is a quick link, really. You can see you can really quickly flick to the correct page in the field ID guide, the NPMS field ID guide, if you're thinking, oh, I'm not quite sure what that looks like, or you want to double check in the field or at home. It's just to make it a lot easier and a lot quicker for you to find that species in the field ID guide.
Rachel, sorry, the question's coming in thick and fast.
That's fine.
Collins asked, at the wildflower level, are we recording literally just presence or absence of each species, or is there some way of recording abundance?
Yeah. For every surveyor level, we record abundance on a domain scale, which are you
going to come on to that? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. You will be. It's not just a present or absence. The only time we just record presence or absence is for extra species. So if you do record something that's of note or rare, or as you've already mentioned, I think Claudia asked, we don't tend to ask for abundance there just because they are additional records. Yeah.
Okay, great. And then a question from Francis. Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's fine.
Francis is asking, do you find that habitats merge and you get a mix of species in those merged habitats? And if so, what do you do?
It's tricky, isn't it? Especially when you've got some quite sort of patchy habitats or quite mosaic habitats. And that's where really setting up your plots, that's where I was talking to earlier, really make sure when you're setting up your plots to avoid that as much as possible. You want to make sure that within your 5 by 5 meter plot, it is a discrete habitat type. So try not to set up your plots where there is that sort of merge, as you say, or that sort of mosaic. You, of course, I mean, it's the nature of the beast and the way seed spread and all this, that, and the other. There will be some species within your plot that will happen to fall on, within different habitat types, because a number of species occur in different habitat types. But just try and set up your plots within a discrete habitat type. Okay.
Yeah.
Good questions. It shows you listening. This is brilliant.
No, it's great.
Because I can't see you, so for all I know, you could have all gone off for a cup of tea.
No, it is.
Right.
Speaking of a cup of tea. Speaking of a cup of tea, Rach, I don't know if we're probably about an hour in. I don't know if there's a natural point if you wanted to. I think it's probably carry on for a couple of slides
after this one. So I was just going to quickly say this, and then we can go on to the actual recording forms of how to record the species. So this is a really good point. So let me just let you know where you can find some support, and then we can have a little comfort break. Is that okay? So I just wanted really to flag, it'll take 2 seconds, where the different places you can find out for, you can go and seek support in ID, not just for species, but actually habitat as well. I think sometimes we can underestimate that initial task of identifying your habitat. But of course, there's the NPMS species identification guide, which is included in your survey pack. Most of our recorders use the Francis Rhodes Wildflower Key. That's a fantastic book, or I'm sure many of you will have your own different wildflower and field ID guides. So just use as many as you have, make sure you take them out into the field with you. But there are also a number of web resources. So the BSBI, Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, have some absolutely fantastic web resources to help ID species. So if you're not familiar with the website, do go and take a look. Some really useful things on there. There's the Species Recovery Trust, which has some absolutely fantastic training resources and guides and aids to field ID, both habitat and species. So that's another sort of top tip from me there, is going to the Species Recovery Trust. There's also National Plant Monitoring Scheme training that's just started, actually, about 4 or 5 weeks ago, and you are more than welcome, and they're publicly available. If you go on to the www.npms.org.uk website and go to online training, we've just started up a weekly programme of training materials, basically, and each week, every Tuesday, we are putting a new instalment on that site, and it doesn't matter that you've missed any. Once they're loaded, they're there permanently, and people can go back to them, people can download them, and they're a real combination of field methodology, but also, which will be very similar actually to this presentation, but we also have habitat specific field ID training within there as well, and that's really been in response to us not being able to get out and see people in the field. And of course we appreciate there's no real alternative to actually getting out in the field and showing people these different species and getting a real feel for them out and about. But we've tried to give folk an introduction to the main indicator species in those different habitats. So as I say, they're completely freely accessible, so do go on the National Plant Monitoring Scheme online training page. There's and for whichever habitats your plots fall within, you should find some extra materials there. The Field Studies Council have some absolutely fab online training courses and field ID guides, as well as the Wildlife Trusts. I don't know if anybody's heard of Identiplant, but Identiplant is another online training course that basically runs throughout the year. And I'm actually doing it myself at the moment, because it's a really great online training program if you are interested in taking up yet more training to help you with your field ID. So that's worth taking a look at as well. So I just wanted to flag some of those sort of other areas if you were really getting into your field ID and wanted some extra support. But other than that, I think it's a good time for a bit of a break if there's no questions.
Yeah, one last.
Right. So we've talked an awful lot about kind of the background and things to think about, but it's kind of time to get into the nitty gritty, I suppose, of actually getting out there, setting up our plots and surveying our sites. So the first thing, just to reiterate, thinking about our plot setup, and you've got some nice examples there on the right, is, as I've already said, using fixed landmarks to help you relocate. That's useful. Certainly set up temporary markers while you're there, but we do ask that you leave nothing behind afterwards to help you re-find your plots. By temporary markers, obviously we mean tapes, poles and whatnot, corner poles. Record the GPS location if you can of your plot. There's a number of ways you can do this. If you have your own GPS handheld device, which not that many people do have, of course, record that. But also there's various ways that you can do it on if you've got a smartphone, whether it's using the Google Maps app, or there are a number of different apps that you can download. There's a great grid reference GR map. I think there's a Geo Explore app that you can download as well that helps you record your grid reference. Certainly do a plot sketch. Seems old school, but it's something that we definitely recommend. It makes you look at the plot a different way. It makes you note down things that maybe you might not have noted previously. So not every visit, of course, but when you're first setting up your plot and deciding where to put it, once you know where it is, do a sketch. You can record that on the survey recording form. There's a nice little box for you to put it there to help you relocate again. Use a written description, so make notes to yourself how to re-find your plot. And something again that we recommend is that you take an annual photograph, or even each time you survey, but certainly an annual photograph from the same point, whether that's, say, the southwest corner, and at the same angle. So really using a mixture of things there to help you relocate, to make sure that you're surveying on the same plot. Don't rely on just one or two. Use as many of those as you can to re-find your plot. As it's got here in big and bold, it's important to find the same location in subsequent years. So that's where you've set up your plot. And then it's time to start thinking about what you actually are recording. So you'll see when you receive them from Nick, our recording forms, they're just 2 A4 sides. They're pretty simple, but hopefully quite straightforward. And we'll just work through them now just to make sure that they're clear for everybody. So on the first page, so recording form page 1, at the top section, you've got your name. Hopefully that'll be quite easy to enter. The kilometre square grid reference that you've been allocated, the date of your first survey and the date of your second survey when it's completed. So that should say the spring survey and the late summer survey. So as you can see, and worth me noting now, you just have the one recording form for both of your surveys. So again, really cutting down on the paper that you're using, you know, all the different recording forms you may need to use. You do use a different recording form for each survey plot, so you have, say, 5 recording forms altogether each year, but you use the same recording form for the same plot for the 2 different visits. So the date of the first survey and the second survey, which level you are surveying at that year, just tick the right box. Then you have a section there to fill in the locational information really about your square. So this really only needs to be done the first, initially the first time you do it. So the grid reference of the southwest corner, as I've said, or if it's a linear plot, the grid reference for each end. Now, even though really speaking that's only essential in the first time you do this, I'd actually say it's really good practice to fill that in each time, for a number of reasons. If there's something else that you have missed out or haven't recorded that year, it makes it a lot easier to find out which plot you're talking about. So you can see there above the location information, there's a little box for plot number. That's because we ask you to basically number your plots. So plot 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 usually. But if you've just sort of missed that box, you've forgotten to enter that, and then you've just carried on and you've conducted your survey, you may come to it later and go, oh no, what plot was that? So it's just really good practice to make sure that you're filling in absolutely everything in that sort of top section for each survey site. Then you have the option there to fill out your broad habitat and your fine scale habitat. I say option, but I mean it's not. You need to fill in what the habitat type is, both broad and fine scale if you're able to do so, and fill that in every time again. So even though you might have plot number 1 and it's a lowland grassland of neutral pastures and meadows or whatnot, or whatever it is, don't feel, well, we already know that for that plot, I'm not going to fill that in each time. Definitely still do. Again, it's good practice to make sure everything's filled out, but also sites can change over time. There may be some management difference or anything at all that may actually have changed the makeup of your plot. Then we ask for some more sort of environmental information about that plot. So if your plot is on a slope, how steep that slope is, only in 3 categories, not too much detail here, whether it's flat, moderate or steep, and then if it is on a slope, what direction that it faces, to include that as well. Then we ask for the management type. That is optional, but it is a very, very useful bit of information if you do know the management type, even if it's simply none. There's no management at all, but that could be something along the lines of grazing, or fenced off to avoid grazing even. It could have occasional cutting. If it's an arable field margin, obviously there's a certain habitat management type there too. So do enter the management type, and do be mindful that, again, that can change between visits. So even if you've entered it for your first, the first year that you're doing this, it may well be different in the second year. It may even be different between your visit 1 and visit 2. So again, you can put in that box, visit 1, grazing, visit 2, no obvious grazing. If there is grazing, please do note whether it was low, moderate or high grazing pressure. and there's guidance on that on page 23 of your survey guidance notes. And you can see there that while things like how steep the plot is and which way it faces, you've only got one option to provide information. That's because things like slope aren't necessarily going to change, whereas grazing may well change. So you've got two little boxes there. So the first box is your first visit, and the second box is your second visit. And as you see, as we go through the recording form, that's a very common feature. There's one box for the spring visit and one box for the summer visit. Again, just so that we can just keep one recording form, one simple recording form for each plot for both visits. You're asked how wooded your plot is from these categories. So again, just 4 simple categories, whether there's dense tree or shrub cover, scattered trees and or shrubs, if it's a hedgerow, or if there are no trees or shrubs. So assess your specific site, your specific plot, and check the box that applies. And again, that's the same for both visits. The next thing that we ask you to record is your vegetation height. And again, we ask you to do that on both your visits. And that's why there's sort of two boxes there to fill out, one for visit 1 and one for visit 2. And that's in these height categories. So we're really looking to asking you to look at within your square, the percentage of your square that is, say, less than 10 centimetres tall, between 11 and 30 centimetres, and so on. And you can see just there's the categories given, in fact, actually on the recording form to save you flicking back through your survey guidance notes while you're out in the field. So if the vast majority of your plot, for example, or even, you know, between 34 and 66% of your plot as your estimate, they're quite broad categories, are under 10 centimetres, it is under 10 centimetres, you simply put 2 in that first box for the under 10 centimetres. And that may well be different in summer. It may be that actually a smaller percentage is that height, and because maybe it's a bit taller in summer. So if I go on to the next page, oh no, it's not there, hang on, let me go back. I thought the next page was different. So yes, I don't know if there's any particular questions about vegetation height there. That I only ask because quite often we do get questions about vegetation height, so please shout if there is. And you've just got a box there at the bottom. Please use this space for any additional comments. So any additional comments that may affect the types of species that we're seeing, or even your ability to survey, whether it's the weather and whatnot, any particular comments you feel are valid to include about your experience recording on that day. And you can do one for your visit 1 and one for and another comment for your visit 2. That's absolutely fine.
Rachel, from Sue, not so much a question, more a good suggestion, I guess, but take a ruler with you.
Yep,
or some kind 100%. Of way of knowing. It's always, you think you know what 10 centimetres is, but it's quite handy just to kind of know.
Definitely.
Know
and you know, I think it's worth saying as well, I think with like loads of these things, the first time you do this, these things will take longer, you know, because you kind of get your eye in, don't you, of what these things look like, and just learning the categories. I think we don't use categories too much, but they are something to get used to, aren't they, for each of the, I think it's only the vegetation categories, the grazing category, and probably the abundance categories. But because, you know, that's 3 different categories to be thinking about, you know, things that we use categories for. So it does take a little bit of time and to get your eye in, and it'll get quicker each time you do it, but certainly ruler in the backpack to get your eye in. So there we go. As I've said, we've got slope and aspect and steepness, management descriptions, grazing, how woodland the plot is, and the vegetation height. That's all sort of the additional survey information besides our actual species recording that we ask you to record. There's the slide that I was expecting to see. So yes, there's a bit of a breakdown there, because I think the first time you look at that recording form, I don't think it's 100% clear. We're essentially asking you what proportion of the vegetation within your plot is within those different height categories, and it's a simple scale of 1 to 3, so less than 1/3 of the area, 1 to 2/3 of the area, and 3 is more than 2/3 of the area. So it's quite a simple category system, just thinking about vegetation height. So that's the first page, and then this is the second page. So you can see it's not the longest recording form in the world. The second page essentially gives us one big box for our plot sketch, which again only really need to do on the first visit. Of course, do another sketch the next time if anything significant changes, or if you feel it helps you. So there's your nice sort of section to include that there. But if you need it for additional notes as well, of course, if you didn't have enough space on the previous side, do use that space for any extra notes. And then we get to the nitty-gritty really, and actually recording your species and assessing the abundance. And we do that using the Domin scale. So again, this is all described in survey guidance notes if you want to revisit later, but I'm going to go through it with you now. So what we basically ask you to do is, thinking about your surveyor level, whether that's wildflower or indicator, or indeed if you're going to do inventory level and you record everything, we ask you to record the species name of everything that you're recording down in that left hand column. And then you've got two boxes beside. I've got the red one there highlighted there for your first visit and blue for your second visit, and that is where you enter the abundance of that species. So you may have creeping buttercup at the top, and say that I'm trying to think now, you've got several individuals of creeping buttercup. You can find what category to put that on that Domin scale above. So if you've just got 1 to 2 individuals, so less than 5% of your square has got that particular species, you select 1. If there's several individuals but still less than 1% of your plot, it's 2, and you can see the categories go up: 1 to 4%, 5 to 10%, 11 to 25, and so on, and each category is given a particular number. So as I say, if you've got several individuals of creeping buttercup but still less than 1%, you'd simply put in creeping buttercup on your first visit and then a 2. That may well be different in your second visit. You may have fewer. That might go down to 1 in sort of the late summer visit. Of course, there is the possibility that there will be species in one visit that's not there on another visit, and that's absolutely fine. So if you record all your species on the first visit, and then you come to do your second visit and you see, oh, well, that one isn't here now, you simply leave the visit 2 box empty. But then again, don't just use that list and go from that list. You need to keep looking in your plot, because there may be other species present in that plot on your second visit that you didn't record on the first, and then you just add them to the end. And of course, the first column for the first visit will be blank, but there will be a number for them there on the Domin scale for your second visit. So I've just got another slide here about the Domin scale. I think a few people have used it for surveys previously, but I think for a lot of people this is quite a new scale to use for recording, and it's really all about, as I say, percentage cover. So less than 1% cover is category 1 or 2, depending on how many individuals. A tip that we give is, if species are really scattered, of course it's quite a hard thing to do, and again, it's a practice thing, isn't it? The more times you do it, the quicker and the more confident you feel in your assessment. But if species are very scattered, we almost try to imagine them as clustered into a corner. So if you pop them all together, sort of how much of an area would that cover? So cluster them together in your mind. And some of our volunteers, that's sort of a tip that's come out, and a number of people basically almost imagine them clustered into the corner of the square and think, okay, how many, say, 50 by 50 centimetre squares would they occupy? Because of course 50 by 50 is 1% of a 5 by 5 metre square, so that kind of helps you to add up a little bit. But there's a reason they're in categories. We're not expecting people to tell us the exact percentage cover. That's why it's sort of between 5 and 10, between 11 and 25. You've got a range there to estimate the percentage cover. And as I say, that's very likely to differ between the 2 different surveys, and some species may be present at one survey and not present on another. So I'm going to go back to that. I'm actually going to go back to that recording form in case there are any questions on that recording form. Where's previous there?
Rachel, the one's coming from Colin. I'm pretty sure I know the answer, but essentially because we missed the early visit,
yep,
all the records in this first season will obviously go down in as the late visit column, yeah, or the late visit box in your form. So you'll only obviously fill one in for this spring. Yeah.
So just fill in the one column. And actually, I mean, yes, just for I guess for best practice, and just to get it sort of cemented in your mind with the methodology, you can use that visit to column, just because that's what you generally be doing for August. So, you know, it's kind of a good practice thing. But ultimately, it's the data that you then sort of submit online, or that you enter in whichever way that you enter it, that matters really. And for that, you're going to enter the date of the survey. So the main thing is that you've got the correct date that you carried out the survey. That's the really important information, really, as opposed to sort of which column that it goes in. But it's good practice, isn't it, to do a column 1 and column 2.
And a question from Rose, we're on the Domain scale.
Mm-hmm.
I've used it a number of times, and it took me a while to get my head around this.
Mm-hmm.
Rose is asking, presumably the percentages will all add up to 100.
Well, so that's
Yeah, exactly.
a really good question.
They don't, do they?
Nick's laughing because it's a really good question. Not necessarily. It can add up to more if you think about the different layers you can get of species. So you may well have sort of a canopy species, for example, or you might have a species with leaves branching over, you know, over a lower species of grass or something. So no, it doesn't always add up to 100%. And of course, there may be some species within your plot that we're not asking you to record, and they might be taking up some space, if that makes sense. So no, don't always try and get it to add up to 100%. Would you agree with that, Nick? Because you were laughing then.
Yeah, no, I've done it before in previous things, and it takes you a while to get your head around it because logic suggests it should, but actually it's a bit counterintuitive. But yeah.
Yeah, just because of the nature, you know, of the species that we're recording, there will be some overlap. So we do ask you to record. Yeah, I think it says here, doesn't it? Record species in all layers, including overlapping shrubs and trees. So no, they will likely. But do you know what? We get that question every single training course. I should have even said it before you asked. So it's a really good question. The other thing to note that I didn't say actually, I just noticed at the very bottom of that species name column. So there's 2 columns. So if you run out of room on the first species name column, there's a second. But you can see there's bare soil. I don't know if you can see, actually, it's not that clear on this. Bare soil, bare rock or gravel, litter, and then mosses and lichens. So you mentioned lichens earlier. We're certainly not asking you to identify lichens, but if you can, please do record on the Domain scale the percentage of cover of these these 4 things. So what percentage of your plot is bare soil? And actually, do you know, that threw up something really, really interesting when we were looking at sort of annual variation in our plots. And funnily enough, I was saying about the 2018 drought. Funnily enough, no huge surprise, but it's nice to have it confirmed, isn't it, with the analysis, that we were seeing a significant, you know, percentage more bare soil, funnily enough, recorded following the 2018 drought, or during the 2018 drought. But similarly again, what percentage is bare rock or gravel? Litter, by litter I don't mean rubbish, we mean leaf litter. You'll see on the new recording forms that is actually that you should be receiving. That's made clearer, because I think that was confusing a few volunteers. They thought we were recording litter as well. And again, mosses and lichens. And again, that helps as well with the analysis, particularly thinking about bare rock and gravel and bare soil. That is almost an explanatory factor as to, you know, the cover and maybe when we're not seeing more of different species. So they're the extra 4 things that we do ask you to record the occurrence of. So let me look at this list and make sure I've not missed anything. So we've got the slope and aspect, we have management description, we've discussed grazing, how wooded, vegetation height, and yes, the Domain scale for both the species, but also bare rock, bare soil, litter, and mosses and lichens. And that really is, you know, you'd think we'd spend a lot of time going through the recording form, but that's it. It's a very, very simple, straightforward recording form. We're applicable with boxes for visit 1 and visit 2. And as I say, you'll need 5, if you are doing 5 plots, 5 recording forms a year. And we do have, you know, because Nick will be sending you them digitally, you know, print out as many as you need. We've all been in the field, they get blown away or they get a bit wet or whatnot, so have spares for sure. So thinking about the equipment list in the field, and now I realise I should totally have put a ruler on here after that suggestion, but I have got tape measure. So thinking about things you need to take out with you in the field, obviously I don't expect you to take a suitcase or whatnot, but there are some really handy things. So of course, and I love a list, I love a checklist, and to make sure that I've got everything with me. Nick, you're doing something with your finger. Oh, you're not putting your hand up, you're doing something else.
No,
I
sorry, I was just getting a bit of
I thought you were asking a question. So make sure you have your survey forms, of course, your survey guidance notes and your species list. Take a map with you, always useful. Clipboard and pencils, tape measure and string. Now for that I had more in mind to mark out, of course you have your plots in mind, but when you're actually there in the field, and from the photos I showed you earlier, it's very handy to actually mark out your plot while you're there. So your tape measure to make sure you're doing it in the right area and the right size, and your string to mark it out. Definitely stick in a ruler. Plot corner markers, always super handy. People have used all sorts. I always like finding out what people use. Sticks, stones, people stick their walking poles in to mark around the corners. Take your ID guides, a hand lens ideally, to help you ID the species that you're looking at. And part of being part of this sort of volunteer group, I'm coming up with all sorts of hints and tips from our volunteers. And somebody recently recommended, if you do have a smartphone that you're already using for whether it's apps or whatnot, a lot of them have a super sneaky, so almost like a hidden feature, that's a magnifying lens and light. And loads of our volunteers have said, God, I'm using this more than my hand lens at the moment. It kind of works through your camera. So there's one in Android and iPhones as well. So it's worth having a little route around to see if your phone has something like that, and that could be really useful if you are taking photos as well, to sort of later verify. So have a little look on your phones. A compass, very useful. A GPS device if you have one. A camera. Take your phone, please, if you have one, obviously for sort of any emergency situations, which then falls on to consider health and safety. So we always say it's a good idea to take, you know, your first aid kit and whatnot. And then, you know, it's really sad that I have to mention it, but of course, thinking about the current sort of COVID-19 health crisis, if there are any particular things that your landowners have requested, whether they've requested, I don't know, using hand sanitizers or masks or gloves or all sorts, make sure that you pack everything that you need health and safety wise as well. So we talked a little bit earlier about access to survey sites, and I think, Nick, you've already sort of said a little bit about this, but please jump in, and I'm going to be asking you specific sort of questions regarding access as we go. As we've said, it's very, unfortunately, because there's, you know, land ownership is quite a dynamic thing and things change hands, and there's so many squares that we can't keep track on it on behalf of volunteers, apart from, I think it's got a brilliant head start with those 18 farms. It is a volunteer responsibility. So permission's obviously required on private land. We've got a number of hints and tips, as I've mentioned, if you would like to visit the resources page of the NPMS website, particularly in our frequently asked questions. We've got some hints and tips about finding out who the landowners are and how to approach them. So for example, thinking about land registry or the local council, local businesses, thinking about Google Maps. So there's a number of different sort of hints and tips on there about how to find out who owns the land. The other thing that I think, Nick, you're planning to provide, if people would like it, is a template permission letter. Is that right, Nick?
Yes. Yep. We can adapt, or we'll probably adapt yours, I guess, Rachel, on that front. But yeah, we'll send one out that you can use as a if you just wanted to top and tail it, then absolutely. Yep. Yeah.
So that's something we kind of, sometimes volunteers feel a bit more comfortable using something that's come from the project specifically, and funny enough, it's no huge surprise, quite often responses tend to be a little bit more forthcoming if it's coming from the project specifically, not, you know, Joe Blogs down the road. So Nick's hoping to adapt our template permission letter, basically explaining what the project's all about, what you're hoping to do, and it comes from Nick as opposed to you. It says our volunteer, and you'd insert your name, is hoping to access for this reason. So that's something that it can provide. And we, you know, this is common courtesy. We don't really need to put this on the slide, but I always think it's worth mentioning. Do make sure that you, if they say yes, send a bit of a thank you letter and keep them informed, and let them know in advance the dates that you plan to visit. That you can have a number of responses. You know, of course, there's the yes, go ahead, and there's the no, please don't. But you may well find that people that say, well, I would want to see what data you're collecting. Again, I can't see, you know, it's on their land. I can't see that being a huge problem. You can just maybe photocopy your recording forms, for example. You may be asked information about insurance or risk assessments or anything like that, in which case I guess you need to refer to Nick if you have any of those particular questions. So just as a heads up, you may well be asked.
Yeah, just to pick
before
up
you
on
can
a couple
access.
of those points, Rachel. Obviously, if you're volunteering under the remit of the Chilterns Conservation Board, so you're covered by our public liability insurance on that front. And you reiterate your point, Rachel, around the landowners want to get our farmers, if they're anything to go by as typical, they love to find out what they've got. So we carried out lots of bird surveys and all kinds of other things. They really like to know what's there. So if you are able to drop them a note and let them know some highlights, or send them your recording form or whatever, then it really does make a difference. And they probably won't know what you're talking about necessarily, but they really like to know what you've found. So
yeah, and it keeps them part of it, I think, and keeping that relationship is really important, isn't it, to being able to carry on surveying on their land. So as long, you know, doesn't need to be reams or whatnot, but if you're able to just drop them a couple of highlights or let them know what you've seen, I think it goes a long way. So again, we kind of have to do this. A lot of it's common sense, and I'm sure you may roll your eyes, but we have to kind of talk a little bit about health and safety. So making sure that you're considering your safety and the access and the landscape. Please do let someone know where you're going and when you're expected back. Be prepared for weather changes. Consider small first aid kit, as I've said. Recce and visit your site, and I've already mentioned. Do think about COVID-19 guidance, both in terms of whatever sort of the local and your regional, the advice that you've been given. In England, we are able now to conduct surveys as long as the landowner is happy and that we're doing so social distancing in mind and being careful, but just think about these extra points. So once you've created your plots, you know where you're going to be going, and you've collected your data, it'll be really important to submit your data. So as I've mentioned, there's going to be a bespoke data entry portal for you chaps in the Chilterns with the Tracking the Impact project, which will look a bit like this. This is a bit of a sneak preview. So you'll have a plant portal. You have your own sort of personal account. You can just log in. You sign up to it, you log in, and you can enter first your plot information. So this Halton Woods is the example that I had from yesterday. So you just simply put in where your square is, what the type of plot is, whether it's square or linear, the label that you've provided it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, for example, and that sort of environmental information that we were talking about, whether it's sloping or what direction. Once your plots are created, you will be able to enter your data simply. So you mentioned what square it is, what plot it was, and then you basically fill out almost a replica really of the recording form that we've already gone through. You just enter it so that it's online. This isn't currently live, and I'm totally whizzing through it here because I believe there is a plan to, if anybody wants any further particular training on data entry or using the website, I think there's a plan to do that a little bit later once we've all basically got started and we're off the ground. So that really is a whistle-stop tour just to show you that there will be a specific plant portal for your data in the Chilterns. Is there anything else to say on that, Nick? I don't think so.
Yeah, just to pick up on that point, where we, in an ideal world, in a whole day course, we would probably get into some bit more detail. But I think, given that we're probably best about 2 hours now, the key thing is getting you ready to go out. The recording forms capture everything you need to know to transfer it onto the website. So we'll probably pick up the website at a later stage, if that's okay. Well, the key thing is getting you ready and out there and getting your plot set up and getting you confident in your surveying. So we'll worry about the online stuff a little bit later down the road, if that's okay. And we'll set something up for that bespoke.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And just the last thing to say really was that it really helps. So for the Tracking the Impact project, it's going to be really, really helpful in detecting the annual trends. It's going to be really important to think about non-natives and climate sensitive species in the area. It will help the team look at direct impacts of physical events, whether that's severe weather or introduction of pests or whatnot. It'll be really useful to look at the changes in land management and the impact that has on diversity and abundance, and also links with other species groups, so like pollinators. So Please do, you know, once you go out, once you've got your data, please make sure that you are able to submit it. And the very, very last thing to say is just where you can find support, really. So you've got the survey packs and all the materials that I've sort of done to death a little bit here. There's a lot of different survey materials that you can get from Nick. There's also the NPMS website that I've mentioned a fair few times. This is all publicly accessible to everybody, not just NPMS volunteers. And there's lots of really helpful things there, from survey guidance and forms, which is basically the survey pack if you need any additional copies, additional resources from sort of frequently asked questions that I've mentioned, useful books and websites for ID access, sort of hints and tips. There's also the online training that I've mentioned on the online training page, where you're more than welcome to go and download presentations on habitat specific ID. There's of course these courses, like the one that I'm giving you now, and hopefully later maybe a data entry course if it's required. And as I say, you're more than welcome to download any of the courses that have come from NPMS. And then of course there's I guess Nick is your first port of call, I would imagine. And that's it really, that's all I kind of had to say.